All right, welcome to everyone this evening. My name is Rob Berger, and I'm thrilled to see you here tonight. Before we get started, just a couple of preliminary announcements. First, if you haven't picked up a Pride guide already, they're on the table back there, and on the back there's a list of everything that's going on. I want to draw your attention to 3 events. On Thursday, there is the art show here at Stonewall, and there's flyers in the back that gives more information about that. On Friday and Saturday, there are outdoor concerts here at Stonewall, and there's a flyer that has all that information too. I want to thank our sponsors. First, our videographer, Lisa Kempton, who's been with us since the beginning recording these events. One of the really important things that's going to come out of tonight in each of these events that we do is there will be a video copy that will be preserved at the Ohio Historical Society. So we thank Lisa for that, and if you have any video needs, her contact information is in the program. Stonewall Columbus has been a sponsor of these since the beginning too, and has always given us free space to hold these events. We thank them. Our other sponsors are the Gay Ohio History Initiative, the Our Stories Project at OSU, and the OSU LGBT Alumni Society. And there's information in your program about each of those groups, along with website information if you want more information about any of them. LGBT history will continue next week. Next week, our event is on Wednesday, June 11th, and it's a look at the history of the transgender community in Central Ohio. Next week's event will actually be on the first floor, so I invite you to come back for that. Tonight, we focus on the AIDS crisis in Central Ohio. There were many people who stepped forward at that time and gave of themselves, both in big and small ways, and tonight you're going to hear from 5 of them. If any of you have any memories you want to share, thoughts or questions, just stand up and start talking. We invite everyone to be a participant tonight. And I'll introduce you to our 5 panelists and we'll get started. We're going to do this from left to right. And completely on the far left is Howard Fradkin. Next to him is Dr. Teresa Long. Next to her is Dr. Michael Pera. Next to him is José Rodriguez, and last but not least, here on the end next to me is Deborah Coleman. And how I thought we would start off tonight is just by going down the line. We'll start with Howard and move down the line. And why don't you just tell us when you first learned about the existence of HIV or AIDS and how you learned about it and what your reaction to that was?
Learned about it from, I was down in Chapel Hill in 1979 working in a human sexuality information and counseling service. And one of the guys who started that was named Hoagie. And just as my partner Pete and I left Chapel Hill to come up here, we learned that he had GRID, which was the original name of AIDS, which was gay-related immunodeficiency disease. Big name. And shortly after that, I had a friend in New York City who was diagnosed with that, and Pete and I went up to New York to go to the Gay Men's Health Crisis Circus, which was held in Madison Square Garden. And I remember going to that, and it was just totally packed, and that was probably, I don't know, 81, 82, I guess. And it was just really overwhelming. Very frightening, terrifying. That was before the first case of AIDS here in Columbus. I think that was probably 82. So.
Well, first of all, you need to know that my hometown is San Francisco, and I was actually practicing both first as a medical student and then a resident, and then later as a physician. So my first experience was one that didn't have a name to it. There were something unusual going on, and all of a sudden there was a very famous case report of several cases of men having immunodeficiency, named GRID, as Howard has just suggested, both in New York and Los Angeles, and then of course in San Francisco as well. And so there was a lot of, I would say, fascination, but fear. What is this? No one had any idea what it was. And so what would we do? How would we, protect ourselves? How would we protect others, etc.? And so this was really at one of the very first points where this disease had ever been, and it wasn't even diagnosed. No one knew what it was. So it was a really pretty fascinating time. I think we're going to talk more about that perhaps later. But that was my first experience with it, was not knowing, and then not knowing, who's going to get it, who's not going to get it, how's it spread, etc.
I heard about AIDS first in probably March of 1981, when one of my colleagues that I had worked with in Chicago had gone to the CDC and worked on the AIDS project. What was the AIDS investigation? Harold Jaffe actually was eventually became head of the AIDS program there. And Harold was at the CDC and called me up about 6 months after I left Chicago and asked me what I knew about Kaposi sarcoma and the relationship between Kaposi sarcoma and viruses. I was a virus researcher at the time and was looking for some insight as to what Kaposi sarcoma would have to do with viruses, because they thought that, and then he started telling me about the cases of Kaposi sarcoma, and the CDC would be reporting these in the MMWR in June, and then he told me about the cases and was looking for some linkage, thought it was a sexually transmitted disease, they thought it might be a virus, and was looking for any help he could get that might be a hint as to what was going on. So it was just, it was just passing, here's a couple cases, not knowing what would happen.
It's also in the early 80s for me. Excuse me, I was living in Pittsburgh, and I remember a good friend of mine, Boyd, brought me a paper clipping and showed me that there was an article in the paper about gay men getting sick. And I remember Boyd and I expressing how grateful we were that we were not living in the East Coast or West Coast, because that was the area where most men were affected, and we were both fearful. But the other fear that we had was that it was somehow genetic. Of course, not being in the medical field, we really didn't know much, but we were just reacting to the fact that thankfully we were not in the midst of gay men getting sick, and we thought we were safe. And I think a large number of community members and people outside of New York or LA or San Francisco thought that it was safe to be outside of those gay males.
Well, I worked at Ohio State at OSU hospitals at the time. My specialty was infectious disease. And I loved to read the weekly MMWR that CDC put out. And there was this headline of two different, one a disease, one an infection, pneumocystis, pneumonia, that I'd never heard of before. And I didn't know what Kaposi sarcoma was. And so I was really captivated by what those were and understanding what they were, but not really having a sense for some time that there was something else bigger going on with that. And I think at the time there was some belief that that was the infection that was causing people to get so sick. That's my first recollection, and then very shortly followed with the articles in the paper. Really a heavy focus, LA, New York, San Francisco. And that's kind of where everything centered for a long time.
Howard, when did you first learn that AIDS was presenting a problem here in Columbus? How did that unfold?
There was an organizational meeting at St. Stephen's Church. It was, I believe it was in the fall of 1982, that Reverend Tom Kinsey, who was the pastor there, organized with Scott Walton and a guy named Jack, who was the first case that I knew of somebody diagnosed with AIDS here in Columbus. There was about 30, 40 people at that meeting, and we just sat around and started talking about what we could do about this. And in retrospect, it was pretty progressive that we jumped right on it, and and there was one case that we knew of. And the Columbus AIDS Taskforce got started pretty shortly thereafter.
And what year would that have been? Can I jump in?
Absolutely.
I think it was 82. We did the first 84, was it?
84.
84.
Yes.
Okay.
84.
I'm a couple years ahead. 84. And we did the first buddy support training in 1985, like in the winter up in Corbett Reynolds. Top floor, it was housed with the assistance of Bob Gill, and there were about 30 people got trained. We had a whole a crew of volunteer therapists who were the initial support services committee for the AIDS Taskforce, and everything at that point was all volunteer, completely. And at first it was a few hours, and it was a lot more hours, and a lot more hours, and a lot more hours. And there was a part of the CATF that did, I don't even know if it was called that at that time. I don't know when it officially got a name, but we just started. They did education, of course. We did some community forums. One of the first forums I remembered was doing had a social worker come in from New York, and we did this session in the Hyatt Ballroom on safer sex. Once we figured out that people needed to do that, and tried to figure out, well, how are we going to make this into something that people will talk about. Brunch. You probably were there, Steve. I somehow remember you being there. I don't know why, but so it was like 1984 or 85, maybe even 86 when we did that. But it was very early on.
What was the outcome of the meeting at St. Stephen's Church?
Well, that's when we started doing the work of the task force. And that's when support services got started. And like I said, it was completely all volunteer. Number of lesbians, gay men, heterosexual folks who were just willing to step up and became part of that initial committee. It was really pretty awesome. And the people volunteered really pretty quickly to become buddies. And the initial buddy support program was just to provide any kind of care somebody needed, emotional support to friends, to family members, to partners. Early on, people got sick pretty quick and needed all sorts of physical help, needed help just doing laundry, grocery shopping, whatever they needed, the buddy was there and provided several hours of support to them each week. We had a whole supervisory network where we had volunteer therapists who organized groups of buddies, and they met on a monthly basis to talk with them about what they were going through.
Teresa, what was your first involvement in the local AIDS issue?
Well, actually, we should probably skip around a little bit because I actually didn't come until 1986. So,
Where were you when we needed you?
So, not that I'm going to take a pass, but I think, I'm happy to jump in there, but I think probably hearing about this story from 1984, I can tell you when I did arrive, there was this very loose-knit, but it did exist, the Columbus AIDS Taskforce, and they had actually just hired a part-time, and I'm going to forget her name.
Nancy, I don't know what her last name was.
Bradenberg.
What?
Bradenberg.
Nancy Bradenberg.
Brandenburg. Nancy Brandenburg. Right, and I remember, didn't she have a little office, I want to say at the YWCA.
Closet.
A closet?
A closet.
Yeah. So I met with her soon after I came. And it was funny because all of a sudden, everyone started coming out of the woodwork going, I founded the Columbus AIDS Task Force. I founded the Columbus AIDS Task Force. And I'm sure many of the founders are here. They're all here. But anyway, so I'm going to pass until we come back kind of in time.
Let me just put a little bit of dates on it. Debbie probably has more documented there. But first, so in 1981, June of 1981, the CDC first announced, June the 5th, I think, or 6th of 1981, they put out the first report saying, here are the cases in San Francisco, in LA and New York. Mostly Kaposi sarcoma, also known as cystic pneumonias. And so they kind of first put it on the map to define it. And then as more and more cases, then there were more reports from San Francisco and other places about what the illnesses that were being seen at the time. But there was no blood test to tell whether people had HIV. They didn't know it was HIV at the time. And it was actually a couple of years before they kind of defined the mechanisms by which people acquired it to know for sure that it was carried in blood, not only by sexual products. So it was a couple of years before that was defined. And then it was not until March of 1985 that there actually was a blood test that you could actually tell whether people had HIV infection or not. And so I do remember that, right away, the Red Cross said, we don't want any blood from anybody who's gay, anybody who's injected drugs. I think that's always been the case, but that was one very quick maneuver. But it was 85 before, and that's where the real issue came with fear, is that between 81 and 85, people would just show up really sick, not knowing that they had this, and all was just sudden present, or gradually get ill and ignore that because there was no way to define what it was until it was too late. And then you'd have AIDS, and you'd be in the hospital, and then the median life expectancy at that time was about, once you had an infection, you lived less than a year on the average, because there was very little treatment for even those odd infections that people were going to get. And so, as more and more people present with these serious illnesses die, then the fear really started. Geez, as soon as the blood test comes out, the blood test means it's a death sentence. Literally, the blood test was a death sentence at that time, because there was no treatment at all, and kind of the band-aids we could do would keep people going, maybe learn to treat the infection. That would just kind of guarantee that they were going to get more serious infection 6 or 10 months down the line. That's kind of the timeline. There was nothing to do. Maybe you can add more
Well, a
dates.
very early memory I have is taking care of a female
Right.
who was from New York,
You were.
and she couldn't really communicate with us. Or Newark, New Jersey? Okay, I knew it was the East
It was
Coast.
Beulah.
Yeah, Beulah, and she was very sick, had lots of complications, and we didn't know for really quite some time that she eventually was diagnosed with AIDS. But she didn't present like everything you've been reading about, including her demographics for what was happening at the time. And then shortly thereafter started admitting very sick, very young men, 30s and 40s, respiratory distress, so scared, having trouble breathing, trouble eating, very alone, quickly put into isolation rooms, and it's just so memorable, that whole experience of I can still walk down the hall and see who was in what room, and the isolation carts sitting outside of the room, and I think a little different context to sort of put this in. There were no fax machines, there were no emails. Everything took time to get information out, and so all the education and learning occurred through conferences. So a couple times a year, you'd go somewhere, you'd get some updates, but every time you got a report, it basically had to be printed and put in the mail. And so it's very different to how we learn information.
There was no internet.
There was nothing like that, and how we share information today. And there were phones, and clearly that worked, and informal pieces of communication. And the systems that were in place at the time totally fell apart for HIV. The mental health systems, the drug and alcohol system, everything that you would normally think of for someone that sick who had no one to take care of them, to go home and needed support because of their diagnosis, that was no longer an option. And so really starting at ground zero in terms of education, there was very little in terms of any kind of advocacy community to really reach out and educate the gay men. There was nothing around IV drug use. And so all of these things were so new. And even understanding culture and the different cultures that were involved. For me as a nurse, I really was experiencing a lot of new learning, and probably, I wish I would have understood what I didn't know then. But you learn that over time. Everything was new to us.
Debbie, can I say something? Early on, and Howard helped me with this timing-wise, because there were a group of us who were very concerned about getting information out. And it must have been 81, 82, somewhere along in there. And the only doctor we knew at that point who was a Dr. Bechtel, who was a dermatologist. And he had diagnosed a couple of people with KS. And so, and I'm sure you were involved in this because it was the same group who got together and did all this stuff. But we decided we needed to try and get the word out to people that something was going on. And there were two guys who had a Channel 13 public access gay TV station. And we went to them, and it became eventually the Stonewall Report thing. And these guys agreed to do this. We got Dr. Bechtel. I actually, someplace, have the tape, have a videotape of this. And we did this show, and we went out and we raised money to do this and to advertise it so that people would know. And several people went to the Dispatch, and the Dispatch at that point had never mentioned AIDS. And we had some professionals do advertisements, and of course this was pretty expensive. And the Dispatch wouldn't initially said no, they weren't going to run anything that talked about this. And they had several of the people volunteer to go down and meet with their editorial board. They approved it, and they ran the ads. We put flyers in the bars. At that point, there was a bar out on the east side called Imaginations. We called it Exaggerations. But we would go in and we had, that was the big bar in those days, and they would tear down our posters. And even after they told us that we could put them up, and I remember going in and meeting with the manager because I was so mad, and he looked at me and he said, the bars are places to have fun, they're not places to talk about serious stuff. And that was the end of our relationship. And that word went through the community, and Imaginations was gone within 6 months, which was interesting. But the show was put on. Everything that was presented was wrong. I mean, it was virtually all incorrect as we look back now. But it was quite an undertaking, and it was very interesting. But it must have been, the Anderson Foundation was formed to pay for it. Bill Anderson was one of the early people who was diagnosed, and his family put together a foundation, and we all contributed, and that paid for all of this stuff. But I don't know, 81, 82, it was early. Because the only thing we knew about was KS.
Well, Stephen's raised an interesting topic, so I'll throw it out to the panel. Anyone have anything they want to say about the reaction of the gay community to the crisis initially? What sorts of responses did you get from the community?
Well, for people who were diagnosed, there was a tremendous amount of stigma. I mean, they pretty much shunned in many cases. And at the same time, there was also a tremendous amount of love and support that people got. But they were talked about. So there was all that going on. Practicing safer sex, I mean, once we finally learned that was something you could do, I mean, was a humongous undertaking to help gay men get some sense of, and everybody really, but when I was just starting with gay men to get some idea that, I mean, who knew about condoms, I mean, maybe if we used them as heterosexuals, but before we came out, but most people didn't know anything about condoms, much less
Dental dams?
dental dams, and why would I want? And they're messy and they're icky, and you have to talk about it, and that isn't how sex happens in the gay community.
I remember the gay community as a nurse in the hospital. One of the first opportunities I had to learn about what was happening in the community was one of the, it was called CAIDs TF at the time, and there was a period after every single, so it took half a page to write the name of CATF. I think it was Scott Walton who came to and did medical grand rounds at Ohio State, and it was unusual for someone who wasn't part of the medical community to come and do that, but he talked about all of the needs, the emotional needs and the issues that were being confronted, and then the people that came to visit and support people in the hospital were counselors that I know worked with Howard and would come at all hours of the night, but they always showed up and they would sit for a long time and provide support. And then the very first community meeting I went to was this very long table at St. Stephen's. It was an education committee, and there was one person from the health department, and there was myself, and everyone else at the time were community volunteers and ready to work. Had to figure out what it was we needed to do, but very engaged and willing to stay. We even met one time, we'd get there and the doors would be locked, and so we'd meet on the steps at St. Stephen's until it got dark. Because we just had to find space as to where we could go.
One of the things that happened back in that time was that gay men and lesbians really didn't work very well together at all. And AIDS was a challenge that many lesbians just raced to embrace their gay male friends and join together. And I think that really changed all of gay politics because there was that coming together and that awareness that this is really serious, and even though it's not affecting our community, at least it wasn't at the time, the fact that lesbians raced in provided so much valuable and important energy and support, because it was a very tough time. I was thinking too about our volunteers coming to the hospital and how we would always get in trouble because, you know, the isolation cart would be out and we'd walk right in. Didn't put a gown on, didn't put a mask on, and many fights with nurses. You're not gonna do that. We were like, we can touch them, we know it's safe.
But that's where I want to interject, because I'm fascinated, because I think there was this upwelling in both gay and lesbian, but at the same time, healthcare workers were terrified. I mean, I think didn't know what it was, didn't know how it was spread, and so when you're pushing around the isolation cart, and you're not paying attention, and you're not wearing your mask or your gown, it's like, what are you doing? And so, I mean, I remember distinctly both at San Francisco General, and I think I remember sharing stories with Mike about the early days when the physicians themselves were terrified both about going into the room, examining the patient, what about wounds or this or that, what fluid had it, what fluid didn't have it, was it something else? And I'll never forget, in the middle of the night sometimes we either had to, whether it was intubate someone, put in a breathing tube or a chest tube, or if you needed a surgeon, that was the worst, because the surgeons basically refused. They said, absolutely not. So there was all kinds of both fear, but I also think so, very both appropriate, kind of heroics. I mean, people were both scared and heroes at the same time of doing what was right. And I don't know, Mike, you probably could share some experiences that were right here at Ohio State.
Well, it was not uncommon for the people to bring the meal and just leave it outside the door.
There you go.
Those people who didn't know, we didn't know very much either, and they were less informed, and so they would just leave the food outside the door, and it would just sit there until they came back and took it away the next day.
Or cleaning the room sometimes?
They would go in and clean the rooms. It was very difficult to get the rooms clean. It was, as you said, I mean, we didn't know how it was transmitted. It was very, very scary for health professionals at the time. That's why we had Scott come to Grand Rounds. My recollection is that it was Scott and Tom Kinsey came to the office, came to my office one day and said, we need to start a community organization supporting people with this disease. And then they actually organized, and it was kind of based out of St. Stephen's for a while, when Tom used it. But Scott really was kind of one of the initial motivators, and he did come to Grand Rounds and talk to the medical personnel. I was always impressed that, people had good friends. Friends who came in and friends who cared for them. It wasn't, there were things that did impress me. Sometimes the families, I was appalled at some families that just wouldn't they got AIDS, and then would just never come back. It was unbelievable to see that they would just AIDS and never show up again. And then there were friends who would come in all the time day in, day out, very, very, very supportive. That was very impressive.
There were so many of those guys early on who weren't out to their families, and so they had this double
Right.
coming out to go through,
Right.
which was part of the terror. Not only, by the way, I'm gay, and by the way, I have AIDS. It's like,
Yeah, Ron Rivera used to say that. I got some bad news and some, and well, I'll give you good news first. I have AIDS. Bad news, I'm gay.
No, I think it was out of all of those heavily charged emotions and fears that really the gay movement, as we know it, all of our generation really organized and got us to where we are today. So I think a couple things that I think were crucial to that movement in the 80s and 90s. I think the lesbian community really stepped out and played a key role in taking care of gay men. Like, I hope we would have taken care of them if it was the other way around. I'm not sure that would have been the case, because the woman factor certainly was clear from both lesbians and straight women. But I think clearly that whole movement really united the community and set the parameters of what would become our gay movement for the next 20 years. So I give much of the credit to the progress that we have made as a community to that tragic era. In many cases, like both Dr. Perry and Dr. Fradkin mentioned, there were no support systems. So we were really all we had, more than ever. So I think that kind of moved that movement way beyond maybe another 20, 50 years. So.
I think going along with the stigma of HIV, it really was for many patients that I worked with having to disclose to the family that they were gay, because they had moved to Columbus from these very small communities in our state and surrounding, and done that purposefully. And I can very easily remember a woman telling me, I can live with the AIDS, but I cannot live with the fact that my son is gay. And we're from Marion, and we have no gays in Marion. And she truly believed it, and
That's still the case.
This actually brings up an interesting point, because in the Morbidity Mortality Weekly that Mike was talking about in June, of 1981, had the gay men at those doctors' offices in New York and San Francisco and LA not been out to their doctors, how much longer do you think it would have taken to figure out that the epidemic was what it was? Because to connect a vascular cancer on the one hand with a type of pneumonia on the other hand and connect the dots, if those two centers had not been where we saw this, how much longer do you think it would have taken?
Well, I would say that that's where public health stepped in, because I think the first physicians may not have gone so deep, but that's where astute phone calls start being made and going, what else about this one, about the two, about the three, about the 10 cases? Get more information, find out everything you can about, yes, the condition, but about how this person lives, where they live, who they live with, what they're doing, anything. And so while it might not have been one physician who was able to put it together, but actually oftentimes it's a very astute clinician who is able to do that. But that, I think, is really the power of medicine connected to public health. So I appreciate you bringing that up. I think that CDC probably wasn't going to release a report to allow more dots to be connected, because it's not as if there were no other cases in the country, but those were the epicenter, so to speak. Those were the first places where the dots could start to be connected, being connected. So I'm not sure how much longer it would have been. I don't know, Mike, do you have a thought about that? I think the astute clinician, and actually I will never underestimate the incredible power of an astute clinician. Now, and the suggestion of the patients being willing to be upfront. I would hope it would be a partnership, just like everything around health and healthcare, a partnership that would allow open communication and disclosure. But I would hope that the astute clinician would dig enough, or a public health professional that they got linked to would dig enough to be able to find out what other linkage points there might be. So that's my take on it. I'm not sure if the patient hadn't divulged, because they might not have actually, I don't know that for a fact, without it being asked or questioned, et cetera.
But it was, so the way it works is they had the first few cases and then the CDC defined what a case was. And then everybody had to fill out the form every time they had a long form, every time they had a case. But that's where they figured, between 81 and 82 or so, they started figuring out it just wasn't gay men, it was transfusion related people, it was the hemophiliacs, it was the hate. It was the remember
Haitians,
Haitians,
right.
Haitians
That was
were
the-
very popular.
Right, right.
Yeah. Belgrade, Florida.
Belgrade, Florida, who
Yeah.
knew, right?
And so it was the public health that kind of put that together early on. There was not, so again, families did disown. There was no doubt, just like you said, just completely, and now you had somebody who was critically ill, who needed a nursing home, who might not have had insurance or Medicaid or any, because they had been somewhat independent, and now all of a sudden they're in a hospital needing somebody to care for them. And that's when, now was there a name for Pater Noster House before that?
It was something before.
Community free job list.
No,
No.
that
No,
was
no,
a
no.
farm, it was before that.
It was before
There was
that.
another house before that.
It was,
Not Joshua House, no.
Joshua.
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 it was on Vermont Avenue.
Right.
Between Perry, and
Joshua.
so there was a place where people who were ill could actually, like a home that they could go to and at least receive, somebody would cook and give them a room to stay in.
I remember walking into that house, Mike, and people would actually die while you were there. I mean, it was an amazing experience. People would they would actually, this is 1990, I'm actually the baby of the group as it relates to the history. I came later in 1990, but there would actually be people, you would walk into Pater Noster to visit a friend, and people would actually die right there. It was like a war zone.
Yeah.
He was the worst of the worst, and I don't mean of the services they provided, I mean of the scene that you would actually encounter. I was never able to go back.
And it was a beautiful home.
It was.
And it was a very old Victorian home and in a neighborhood. And I got called to help them write their infection control policies. And trying to figure out how to do that in a congregate setting where people had so many different infections and there weren't that many sinks and there weren't really that many people taking care of people.
It was a house.
It was a house,
It was a house.
and that we had some gloves and some other pieces, but what were we gonna do with the trash? And, at what point, of course, then the neighbors got quite involved and didn't want this in their neighborhood. So it became even more important to think through some of just the basic safety things, because you really didn't want a dog getting in the trash and carrying some infectious waste down the street. And trying to think through all of those issues and how to make it a home, but yet it needed a hospital bed and it needed the commodes and had carpet, and how do you deal with that when a lot of the complications had to do with really severe diarrhea. And very complex, but people really stepped forward and at least gave an option, because nursing homes at that time, there may have been one in Ohio. And they were a very sad place, and no one really wanted to go there. And there was some hospice options a little later in the mid-'80s, but that required a 24-hour caregiver in the home. So that presented some issues as well.
Actually, I think the first nursing home, when did that, I remember,
There was one.
Was it Brighton House?
yeah, it was Brighton House.
Yeah.
But that didn't open up as an option until like
92.
after I,
It was in
yeah,
the
it was
90s.
it was after I was here.
Yeah.
So,
Some would take them quietly. I mean, occasionally, we'll take them if you don't tell anyone else,
Right,
because
gotta be
we'll
secret.
become.
Right.
we don't want to be that.
Yeah, that was one of the things. Every hospital, every provider had this fear that if they took one, they would be known as the gay doctor or the AIDS doctor or the AIDS hospital, or the AIDS the dentist in particular. All right, I'll do one, but I don't want to have it known because then I'll be inundated and I'll lose my whatever. That was actually a common scenario.
What sorts of issues were associated with funeral homes?
They didn't take, I think at first it was really difficult finding anybody. I mean, maybe there was, shedding your day, I don't know.
O'Shaughnessy got,
O'Shaughnessy.
Mary Ellen O'Shaughnessy got involved pretty early, as I remember.
Yeah, I mean, that may have been the only place at first.
I don't remember too much of a problem with that. I mean, I was signing a lot of death certificates then, and I don't remember there being that big an issue. I mean, there may have been a limitation, but it sure didn't seem to be. I think they can leave their hands off of things pretty.
It wasn't that easy though, as I recall. There was only one, there was lots of concern about, picking up the body, where were they gonna get it, triple bagging it, how many different pairs of gloves. And I remember hearing stories of, triple embalming these bodies because they didn't know what to make of them. And of course they would have to be cremated. Why? So
We're charging an extra fee to take care of infectious waste.
I'm sure. So all of these things were a part of that. I remember being called out to inspect the hospital morgues to see if they were doing it correctly because somebody was complaining or this or that. So
Early on, Rhonda Rivera, who was a lawyer at the OSU Law School, who mostly did gay right issues. I think that was her primary focus, her academic focus. Probably led the charge in terms of if there was something legal that needed, she would be there to assist it. So if somebody was getting kicked out because their landlord found out they had HIV, she would be there to help them. And she spent a lot of time in a lot of different venues doing that.
That was another one of those kind of odd places where the lesbians came into play, because I remember more than once getting a phone call at 1 o'clock in the morning. Come to the hospital right now, someone's dying, we need a witness for a will. And there would Rhonda be at the bedside at, like the last minute, and needing, and so that was, often the lesbians got called to do that. Of course, we were doing a lot of caretaking. One of the other things that, interestingly enough, I just got an email about today, when you talked about the Red Cross and the blood crisis, we started doing blood sisters and encouraging lesbians to give blood when they investigated them not to. And I just was contacted by a woman at Rutgers who's doing academic research on blood sisters. I want to know about blood sisters in Columbus, but we had a fairly active, we had quite a little battle with the Red Cross because we were insistent that they would code it as, they wanted us to just sort of like be donors.
No, this is lesbian.
No, lesbian.
Rock it that way. We want it to be excruciating.
About that part. And I got that broke something down my brain. But that was when Jose, when you were talking, and Howard, you mentioned it too about the sort of the politics of it. I mean, and the activism, a lot of that bubbled up in the lesbian community because the guys were sick and dying and taking care of each other, and so a lot of that early political stuff, that was what Rhonda was doing, and a bunch of us were doing that kind of stuff as well. And a lot of what we know now about advanced directives and powers of attorney and wills and all of the stuff that we know as LGBT people we have to do to protect our rights came directly out of that.
Absolutely.
Mike mentioned Ohio State because of Rhonda, but I want to just acknowledge that what I experienced from a history perspective as far as Ohio State. Ohio State provided a lot of great leadership to that crisis. People like Rhonda, who were fortunate to live in a community in which there was expertise, people like Mike. But then there was also the huge loss that Ohio State suffered in which I could probably count in both hands great talents that would have led Ohio State to many more great things, and that were gone. You know, many professors and all kinds of people that were making great contributions that we lost that were employees of Ohio State. I can think of several professors and researchers and people of all walks of life that worked for the university that we lost.
Well, and wasn't that a part of the issue that the university had to come to grips that they too had gay people working or gay men working in it? And I remember a lot of those
So there was
meetings.
so actually, Ed Jennings was president, I think, and he got a console, and the head of Malcolm Bearwood was the head of communications. Rhonda sat on it, and a couple, I was on, infectious, Dr. Perkins was on it. And basically to develop policy for the university so that it was fair and that there wasn't any hysteria involved and that it just wasn't at the faculty level, but it was at the staff level and at the student level as well, and wanted to be sure that everybody's rights were protected. And so he was way ahead. Not that he ever understood, but he wanted to at least assure that the policy was established.
I think it brought to light about the same time the issues of confidentiality, because this is all pre-HIPAA and all of those pieces that we now assume. And someone with AIDS, you would know when somebody came into the emergency room, and word spread because they either wanted you to go or it was talked about because people were still learning. And so we had to convene a confidentiality task force and come up with training for all of our staff and waivers and really take it to a whole new level in order to protect people's information and help them feel that if they got tested, we could protect that information and deal with anonymous testing. That came out around that time, and how we would approach that. And a lot of issues that we take for granted today really popped up during this situation.
One of the groups I wanted to acknowledge was the Ohio Department of Health.
Yes.
That convened a meeting, and I think whenever the HIV test came out, like in '85, it was shortly thereafter they convened this task force of, again, around 20, 30, mostly gay men, some lesbians, who went up to Mohegan State Park, and we met for, I don't know, a day or two, and just talked about what did we believe the policies of the Ohio Department of Health needed to be around HIV testing. And I was like really impressed. It was like,
Who was the leadership at ODH that brought that about?
Was it Buck?
Tom Halpern.
Tom Halpern.
Was the
Bob
director.
Campbell, Lois Hall.
Bob Campbell, Lois Hall, Buck Harris, were the major people.
And when Buck Harris dressed up as a giant condom and gave.
You know, there was another real hero as far as the state is concerned too, and that was Dave Hobson.
Right.
Yes.
Because Hobson was president of the Senate, Republican, in a very big Republican majority.
From Springfield.
From Springfield. He's just retiring from Congress now, but he took the leadership, and Ohio established a very progressive AIDS policy, far and away better than, frankly, I think California and New York had at that point in time. And it was because of his leadership and his working and insisting that this thing was going to happen. It was pretty amazing, actually.
Yeah,
Where did his inspiration
1988.
come
Steve,
from?
that's interesting to bring that up. Mike was recently honored with an award from the Ohio State University, and Mr. Hobson flew in to present Mike with the award, and I was very struck by what he said, that would be probably one of his proudest accomplishments in his years of service. So,
I don't know what his,
In 1980.
he met with lots of us. I mean, Lynn,
Jerry Mayer.
and Jerry, and I mean, we worked with him and educated him, but he was, for some reason, he was so open about this.
So he, like one of his friends or neighbors, literally, was a urologist, a Cuban urologist, I think, in Springfield, who read about it early on and impressed upon him that this was a crisis. And he kept bugging him, this is a crisis. He'd been a donor drug too, I suspect. this is a crisis. And Hobson believed that.
Yeah.
Just a single physician in Springfield, Hobson believed it, took it to heart, thought that there ought to be fair policies, and kind of opened it up to wide input. And like you say, he did, as he said, this was my best bill over my years, was the AIDS bill.
What sort of response did we see come from our local political leaders?
So,
There's the answer, isn't it?
Well, Bill Myers was,
Bill Myers was
but Lashutka maybe was mayor.
Buck Reinhardt.
Buck
no,
Reinhardt.
I don't remember Buck. I do remember Gordon Key and Greg Lashutka. Now, so when was Gordon? That was when Gordon was here.
First time?
95-ish, maybe. They actually had an AIDS fundraiser at the Ohio Theater. And,
Right.
And Lashutka actually was wearing an AIDS button, 93-ish, and actually met Max Fisher's daughter.
Oh, yeah.
Max
Yes.
Fisher, Fisher Body, Fisher School of Business. He met her in New York somewhere, and he had an AIDS button on, or an AIDS red ribbon. That was the red ribbon, by the way, was the first ribbon.
Yes.
Did you know that? Yeah, that was the very first ribbon.
Well, Greg also lived in German Village and was surrounded by gay people. And I mean, Greg Lashutka used to come and sing Christmas carols at my front door. I mean, he was a neighbor, and this is the kind of, and so I think that relationship also, he knew a lot of people who were HIV early on, and so he was impacted by all of that, I think.
I want to also give some credit because I actually do think that whether it was Buck Reinhardt actually called me in San Francisco and asked if I'd come to Columbus, as did our Governor Celeste at the same time. And credit to Bill Myers, who had then been the director of our public health department. He said, we want somebody who both has some experience around this and can help us figure out what this community can do. Would you come? And a few others from around the state called, and it looked like a great opportunity. So I was thrilled to come here 22 years ago.
I actually didn't know about Reinhardt did it.
Well,
Yeah.
Bill called.
Earlier.
So many of us would have said,
But Reinhardt, who?
Isn't he doing the doodah parade
yeah,
this
something
year?
like that.
So he didn't call me, and I felt I was a pretty young professional in San Francisco to get a call from the mayor of what was then, I don't know, the 17th largest city in the country, and then from the governor, and from some public health people. There was a very famous public health person, probably not known here in Columbus, but named Bill Keck, Dr. Keck up in Akron, and he called me, and that was perhaps very convincing. He's like, I need someone like you to work with. You have the state capital, you got to work over our state health department, etc. And so it was very interesting, the opportunity to do a lot of things. I think Columbus is an amazing place for a lot of reasons. But actually Debbie has gone back through her files more than I have, but she actually here's a visual.
Yeah.
But some of you may remember this, yes, I've seen some yeses. But this was actually the Columbus and Franklin County AIDS Community Plan dated 1989 to 1991. And the introductory letters, it actually shows the quilt. The quilt was brought here, that was 1988, I think, when it was up at the university.
Where is that?
Wait, was it the Woody Hayes thing?
It was
That
the Woody Hayes.
was later, that was in the
Later,
90s.
so when was this? This was at the university. Do you
That was the picture. The picture is the AIDS quilt. The first time the
That's
AIDS quilt
Washington.
came to.
No, this was in Columbus, it was the first time it came.
The first time it came to
Where
Columbus,
was that?
it was in
Where-
Woody Hayes.
Yeah, right, yeah.
It was amazing.
It was amazing. I mean, that was an amazing thing, and we were, of course, proud to both help and had both our own staff and many of the volunteers, et cetera. But the plan, and actually I'm very proud of the plan, but it was actually dated April 6th, and the first letter is from Dana Jean Reinhardt. So indeed, he was willing to stand up and write a letter and sign it. The president of city council.
What was the date on that?
April 6th, 1989. And again, community plan. Jerry Hammond was the president of city council.
That's right.
Bill Myers was the health commissioner, and there's one more here. Michael Jelpy was actually the
yes.
chair. And again, he was not the first chair because we actually did organize, and Debbie and I were just chatting about that. I came in 1986, and one of the first things that I did in this community, and it actually allowed me both to understand our own staff And there are a lot of talented and committed people, as Howard and I were just sharing. But also to meet some in the community, as one of my first projects was to put together the AIDS coordinating committee plan. And it was interesting because I remember going on radio shows back in 1986 and talking about that and then trying to sell it to city council. We finally got money. It was the first money that the city had put on the table at all. It happened in the 1987 budget. We also, as a part of that, committed to fund community action grants to community organizations who would be working in either AIDS education and prevention or in services. Also, it allowed us for the first time to have staff. So one of the first things I did was, hi Debbie, that was 1987. We got a lot done in a year because I think it was about August of 87 or so. But we did have a AIDS Community Advisory Coalition. We can come back to that. But there were several chairs before Mike Jelpy. But obviously, I think Mike Jelpy was our first gay man to chair the group. So anyway, we can come back to that. But there was a lot of planning. But there was, of course, political interest. The members of council were committed. Cindy Lazarus, I think many would know that name. She was interested. There were other members of council as well. And I remember going to each of them to try and sell them that, yes, you've got a health department that needs to be involved in this, but you have to support us and give us some resource to do that. And this is how I would recommend that we think about it, both around education and prevention and the service side. And obviously, the rest is history, as they say.
I think that's the first time I got a sense of the political nature of the gay and lesbian community. Because I was a nurse at the hospital, I had worked with Rhonda doing lots of in-services, we teamed up. But I got a call from her, and she said, I want you to come to a meeting at my house. And it was very clear that you show up. And so, okay, so I walked in, and she had convened, I believe, like Elliot Fishman and people who had been involved to that point, and they'd gotten a wind of the health department pulling together a plan, wanting to move that forward. And they wanted to support the health department, but they also wanted to make sure that there would be support for the community. So they came to me as sort of this neutral, naive person who, and said, will you go to city council on our behalf and tell what you've experienced and who you're taking care of and the talks you're giving and what the needs are. And so I did, and that's the first time I actually met Bill Myers. I'd met you once before, but very smart, I think, on their part, and planned very strategically who the speakers would be and how that would roll out. And it was 10 years before other cities had any funding. I mean, we had funding for community agencies up to almost $400,000 when big cities had nothing. And so it really did, between Teresa's planning, the political folks stepping forward, the community being behind it, it put us in a position to really be able to better serve and come up with community agencies and support.
Yeah, I'm sure that was the money that probably funded Gloria Smith.
Eventually it did, yes, that's the very first 50,000 was the ATF.
Because like we said at that time, there was a half-time social worker, that was it.
Okay.
Until she came
I would
on
use the
board.
term social worker loosely.
Yes, loosely, yes.
Well, and I have to kind of sort of honor the grassroots community side, because we also had this other whole side of things. I mean, talking about sort of the medical community and some of that kind of stuff, and what the city was doing. We also had ACT UP, and we had some pretty interesting stuff going on there. We had, I never handled so many condoms in my life, is that, going out everywhere all the time, passing out condoms, and the whole controversies around
The Lesbian Avengers?
the Lesbian Avengers, did a lot of AIDS stuff. And I remember massive meetings about, closing the bathhouse, not closing the bathhouse. And sort of
That was her job.
I'm
sure we have some good interaction about that.
And the sort of community side of that.
That's
The
fine.
whole segment of our community that just really has their heads in the sand about the whole epidemic and just wanted to continue the sort of free love and partying of the 70s. And, it was a very, internally, it was a very conflicted and convoluted.
Well, I'm glad you're bringing up a couple of really important things. I mean, I think we've talked about the coalescing of the gay community of gay men and lesbian women around this. I can tell you that, to me, there's never been a better example of community activism than ACT UP. And of the grassroots gay community, both through ACT UP, but also the ability to be right in politicians' faces, or key administrators, but also to behind the scenes to be making deals, shaking hands, saying, okay, I won't do this to you if you'll do this for us. And it's pretty fascinating, I think, because I now, having both, so to speak, grown up in this era, I look for other issues that are big and go, where's the outrage? Where's the community activism? And I still ask that, again and again, because that was so powerful. I mean, how it turned around both CDC and NIH doing huge things, but
fast track drug approval.
Yeah,
Sure.
I mean, so many legacies.
Yeah, I mean, I do really think that
It's such a,
that was truly the most remarkable thing about the epidemic. It actually what reminds me the most is Michael Greer is telling me when I said, Michael, you got this disease and you're going to have to be in the hospital for 3 weeks. And he said, like hell I am to me. And my wife went,
It's the power of outrage.
it was like 1986. It was like, well, first of all, most people who got sick were 60-year-old people who had told, the doctor told them what to do and they said, yes, sir. But here, I'm talking to a 20-some-year-old who says, the hell I am. I'm dying and I'm not spending my, 3 weeks of the last 6 months of my life in this rat hole. He was very forceful. and I literally I can still remember getting faint thinking, oh my God. Nobody's ever talked to me like that. And so it really was, I think, the biggest step forward for patient activism ever, that all of a sudden they had a right to have a say. Breast cancer patients never did this. Nobody ever did anything. Nobody ever talked back to the docs ever.
Well, and Michael, it was interesting too, because I can tell you, there were more than one occasion when there were a few telephone calls exchanged and something needed to be done. And so I would get a hold, or Jumpy would get a hold of one of our city council people or people at the mayor's office, and it was, well, we hear ACT UP's gonna do this, that, or the other. So you better deal with us reasonable folks first, And so there was always that, and we all, of course, were all talking behind the scenes, and everybody knew what everybody was doing, but it was a very effective political tool. They were great. Those guys were terrific.
And it really did, for kind of the medical side, it really moved things forward, because Michael saying that forced me to go out and look for somebody that could give him the IV antibiotics at home. That was almost unheard of at the time, to give somebody something at home, because you would bring them to the hospital and they would stay in the hospital as long as the IV stuff. And all of a sudden, there was this need to give, and unfortunately, as the epidemic went on, about 25% of people would get CMV in the eyes, and they would have to be on IVs. And literally, this actually turned medicine around to you don't have to be in the hospital.
It turned many of us that were non-clinicians to flushing IVs, doing all kinds of things we should not have been doing.
But it created the home care industry.
It did.
Think about
It
that.
created the home care industry.
It didn't exist.
It really did.
It didn't exist.
It was just all of a sudden, young, vibrant, outspoken people were not going to be stepped on any longer. They knew
You have
they
to
were.
throw in the pissy gay man piece, though.
Thank you for bringing
I can think of a number of other young men who might not have been quite so vociferous.
Still, and they were, they're dying, and they weren't going to screw around with They weren't going to screw around with the FDA saying, I'm sorry, it takes 3 years to approve this drug that's going to save my sight. The hell with that, And that's when the FDA kind of went, well, and it was funny because all these medicines that were kind of drifting through the usual regulatory bullshit that people needed for cancer and other things, all of a sudden they moved their targets to gay men with HIV, where there are a lot of volunteers, and the FDA changed policy about how to put things through on a fast track. It actually changed approvals of medicine. It created the home care industry. I always said it was it made surgeons put glasses on in the operating room so they
Gloves, come on,
gloves.
no one wore gloves. Nobody wore gloves, ever.
No
Universal
dentist ever wore gloves.
Yeah.
No dentist ever
Or
wore gloves.
surgeons.
But there were
They usually
doctors.
were.
Sometimes.
Most of them wore gloves. But no dentist ever wore gloves until HIV came along. I mean, it really did change healthcare for much, much the better. I mean, I always thought it was HIV pushed the envelope every step of the way. HIV was pushing the envelope. I mean, when AZT was released and the price was like astronomical, and ACT UP chained themselves to Wall Street and closed down Wall Street. They did.
That's right.
Closed down Wall Street in 1988 or 89. I mean, that was like nobody had ever done it.
It was the power of outrage was
Yeah.
terrific.
But HIV pushed the envelope, but gay men pushed the envelope.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, I say HIV. I actually mean gay.
Yeah.
Men. I'm sorry. It was gay men acting because of HIV who pushed it.
Smokey, I remember my friend James. Do you remember James Foreign?
Yes. Who was a physician?
Was a physician, a young physician. James got sick in San Francisco, and a couple of us, he got cryptosporidiosis. And so a couple of us flew out to pick him up. So we knew he couldn't practice anymore. So we brought him back to Columbus. And we came up with a 7-day a week, because his parents were Mennonites. They wanted nothing to take care of him. So 7 of us took schedules and basically took care of him for a year. He did not want to die. He had the fear of God in him, instilled by his parents. But it was the power of activism, of getting a network of people to take after James, who was then, I think, 30 or 31, and take care of him for a whole year. He was so weak he couldn't get out of his bed. Rob Crane, Dr. Crane, took care of him, at home. It was just amazing to watch the networks just pull in and do whatever it took. One thing I wanted to mention was Gloria Smith.
Yes.
Gloria was key to the history of HIV in Columbus. She was clearly a remarkable woman who had the ability to go to a drag show at night and have a great time and have lunch with the mayor. And he really took that ability that many of these panelists have to do it all and to mix in with all kinds of key audiences. And Gloria was really a remarkable, much of the progress that I think that we made in the later years of HIV, Gloria became the face of HIV.
And she served as the executive director of CATF from when to when?
87.
87 to 2002? 2003?
She was
The late 90s, I'm not
Because
sure.
I left
I'm
CATF
thinking
in
it's
2000 and, no, she was still there in 2000 when I left.
There you go.
he was right around that.
Yeah.
But the hire was 87.
Is that right?
That's
Yeah, that
she
sounds
started
right.
a week
Many
before.
agencies came and went.
Yeah.
Well, and actually, Debbie was commenting about the AIDS Community Advisory Coalition, and that was actually formed, she informed me, that the first meeting was held right prior to her coming, so it would have been in like August or September of 1987. So a lot was happening right about then, both for city funding, for AIDS Community Advisory Coalition. The whole concept was, my experience in San Francisco where there were thousands of organizations formed, and it really diffused the opportunities for some focused work to happen. And so if we could get people together at the table, whether it's businesses along with political leaders, gay community leaders, the religious groups that had kind of walked away, they came back, United Way, the social service agencies, and allow that dialogue, the ACT UP dialogue, to at least, maybe not ACT UP, but to have some conversation together both in the room, and then they could leave and have more conversations and around a round table. And that actually was really very powerful. And the Community Advisory Coalition was actually first chaired by Paula Spence, one of the titans in our community, which it's fascinating to me that she was willing to do that. I'm glad she was. And Paula Spence was a lead of Hammeroff Millenfeld Spence, chief marketing, known as one of the titans, the only female titan this community really has had. Well, maybe not now with Abigail, but nonetheless, a very important person. She was followed in that leadership role by someone who many people wouldn't know, named Pat Ross. Pat Ross was the CEO of Rax Restaurants, a fast food organization that was located here. So it was very interesting that the business community was willing to step up, whether they got it that it was a part of their community commitment, but a part of their business plan as well, to see that this community did respond well, both to prevent future cases and to provide appropriate and caring services for those who were infected.
I think another area where we saw some of that real kind of cutting edge change was in schools. My daughter was in high school in the early 90s. We had quite a battle getting accurate AIDS education in health classes and biology classes, and the whole it was a whole new face on the sex education debate that pushed a lot.
And CATF was really, pushed and pushed and pushed to get into the schools. I think it was pretty darn successful at it, but it would have, sure could speak to that, Smokey, but it was,
I think that's true, and it was tough. But I also think there are times I really wonder if we did a disservice, because one of the things we wanted to do was put a face on the epidemic. And so we had clients who were doing a little bit better, and we'd take them with us, and we'd say, you can't tell by looking, and I got a skinny guy with purple spots, and these kids are like, what do you mean you can't tell by looking? This guy's a skinny guy with purple spots. And I sometimes wonder if that was not our best move. I think it did humanize it, and that alone was worth it. And I'll never forget, my friend Don went out to do a presentation at one point, and he was a rather buff Italian fellow, and a fourth grader raised her hand and said, aren't you awfully fat for an AIDS patient? He just was, it's kind of like not what you expected. But at some point that stopped, and we can talk about what things were like in the beginning, but there's this generational kind of missing piece. If Ryan White were alive today, he'd be 37 years old. Think about that for a second. 37 years old. So there's a whole group of kids, when you bring up Ryan White, they're like, who? And that's not a useful image sometimes, I think, for us. I don't ever want to forget that name and that face, but I don't know that that's a good, kids today are not connecting with that. And there's now a whole generation of kids that's not had sex ed in schools, again, because of the abstinence-only policies.
It's interesting, having a 12-year-old daughter who's in 6th grade, she had her HIV education this year, but it's completely separate from sex education. They haven't gotten that yet. Or maybe they have, but it's separated. It's very interesting. They talk about body parts and HIV. I don't even know what that's about. But it was separate. And then they separate the girls and the boys, and then they talk about sex and whatever else they want to talk about. But it is interesting that somehow we haven't made all those connections. And is it enough? Health Outreach needs to do so much. And thanks to some activism, our state has finally accepted some money again this year to help provide.
And turned back a big chunk of money
in the
mandated abstinence only.
Yeah. Right. So
There was that double.
What was the outrage?
Does anyone want to talk about the education and publicity efforts that were necessary both for the communities at risk as well as the larger communities that just weren't fully educated on what was a problem and a risk and what wasn't?
I want to give credit to my drag queen friends.
Yeah,
Not that I have any. But the drag queen community did a remarkable job. every drag queen in this town has held a fundraiser when other people wouldn't. So that was part of the activism movement that really happened throughout the 80s and the 90s. I remember when I was living in Boston in the 80s and later here in the 90s, that's where, those were the folks doing a lot of the grassroots education, along with many health department people and CATF people that would be at the bars in the middle of the night passing out condoms during drag shows. So it was that kind of work that I think at the grassroots level educated a lot of the community, took government and not-for-profits going to where the people got, whether that meant the bathhouses or the bars.
Do you guys remember that series of black and white posters that CATF had out? I know they have them framed on the walls now, and then they had all those letters that people had written that,
We funded those.
yeah, that was pretty cool.
It was interesting because, again, how this started. We had to have local messages for communities. And I say communities because a lot of people, the African American community, if it wasn't specifically designed for them, they wouldn't pick it up. The gay community, if it wasn't local information and written by local people, and a lot of information initially, we didn't exactly know how this was spread. We didn't know a lot of information about oral sex and was that safe and what the different pieces were. We assumed it wasn't because we knew how other STDs were spread, but people wanted really specific information that we didn't always have. And the safety of condoms, well, was one enough? Did you need two? There were lots of questions around that, and the whole lubricant issue that kind of started off one way, and then pretty soon they decided non-oxynol 9 caused more harm than it did good, and that switched. And even learning terms. If you got the medical person describing it, first of all, we didn't know what some of the terms were, and second of all, we weren't comfortable using them. And so trying to, I can remember sitting in my first meeting and I had no idea what they were talking about. And leaving and going home the next week, coming back and still not knowing, what these terms were. And well, of course I did eventually, but I just sat there and turned red. And but I kept coming back, so eventually I figured it out. But it was, and actually a lot of the men at the table didn't know either. We were all learning at the same time in some of this. And so then how did you talk about that? And was it a urine? We didn't know,
I still remember just carrying around my dildo to all those talks and rolling that condom down and teaching people how to put on a condom and just getting comfortable with that. And then there was the time Mike and I were in the same panel and I said, well, because we were talking about kissing, whether kissing was safe. And I said, well, Mike Power, I remember him. It was reported to me that he said, you need a bucket of saliva to transmit the virus. And Mike was like horrified. I never said that. And I've been quoting him for years.
Yeah.
Well, what I wanted to, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I wanted, so early on, more than just early on, people were diagnosed with HIV. There really wasn't any treatments. Life expectancy was a year, and after we learned to treat the opportunistic infections better, it was almost 2 years. But it was still a death sentence, so when people were diagnosed, it was, it was pretty traumatic. And so I depended on the mental health community in the town to help with that. And I have Howard's here, and more than hundreds I had referred to the mental health community, the gay health professionals in town to help with who could relate and who had experience at it, and who helped a lot of people. And I want to give, in spite of gallons of saliva, I want to credit Howard for what he did. He helped a lot of people.
Well, Well, Howard, you're also instrumental with the whole Healing Weekend thing that I think you should talk about, because that was really
Yeah.
a big thing.
Two things that are significant. One is the support groups that we started doing at Affirmations, and then a number of other people started doing them as well. But they were, at first we had probably, first a couple, then there were 10, then there were 20, then oftentimes there would be a night when we'd have like 30 guys, and we had 3 therapists, myself, Don Loffersweiler, and Jim Hodnan, and we'd split up into 3 rooms in the building, and we'd have a large group at first, and 30 people crowded in my office. Was amazing. There was hardly any room to even breathe, but they all crowded in there. We checked in with each other, and then we split up into small groups. And at first, there was no treatment, and I wrote to Rob, one of my fond memories was a night when Chuck piped up and he said, "I don't know, I think we need a contingency plan because we might just live." And that was like radical to suggest that you could live, and then most of the group was just pissed off with them. They were like, "What do you mean?" And Chuck was like, again, it was that kind of rage that I'm just not succumbing to this. Ohio Department of Health in 1987, thanks to Tom Halpern again and Buck Harris and Lois Hall and Bob Campbell, agreed to have us do an AIDS Healing Weekend, which we had. The first one was supposed to be actually at Mohegan State Park, and I called them up and told them what we were going to do, and they said, "Fine, come on up." And a week before I called them up, I said, "No, I just want to be sure you don't need any training, about AIDS for your staff." And they went, "AIDS? What do you mean?" And I was like, "Well, I told you this like 3 months ago when we booked this, and so they like freaked out and didn't want to do it, and we arranged to do it at the Sinclair Hotel was the first one, which is now I don't know what it's called, up there in Morse Road.
Ramada.
The Ramada. But they were very willing to have us come there, and then we went down to the Holiday Inn, and it was again, it was pretty progressive. Jim Geary from the Shanti Project came out and again helped train us and figure out what we were supposed to do with this weekend. But it wound up being a weekend where we provided, again, a lot of support. There were sometimes 80 to 100 folks who would come, again, mostly gay men, and then it sort of changed into some women came, and then heterosexuals came, and bisexuals came. And but we did rebirthing and polarity therapy and reflexology and massage and
Healing touch.
Healing touch and sound therapy and anything that was kind of like out there, we did. And introduced people to the idea that that medicine was really important, and Dr. Perrer or other physicians came to the weekends and talked about that piece of it, and then we really helped provide support to people to just understand that there was a lot you could do, there's a lot you could reach out to. It helped eliminate a lot of the shame and a lot of the stigma that people felt, and they could then go back out and talk to people.
I think it also gave a way to memorialize folks too, though.
Yeah.
That was such a, from a clinical standpoint, I think that was such an important function of that.
Yeah, that was one of the things that we did on one morning, was just to do a memorial service, and people would light a candle for anybody who had died, and so obviously there were lots and lots of candles up there, but it was really important for people to acknowledge the loss.
To give it a little more context, we keep talking about 1987. Well, in December of that year is when Columbus had their first 100 cases. So all of this had been developed and was happening when we'd had 100 people reported with AIDS in our community. So quite a bit, considering the number. We'd had 40 people die by December of 1987. 8 out of 8.5, or 85% were gay men. And interesting when we were talking about everything that happened, and then to think that's when we hit 100K.
That was also the year that the AIDS clinical trial unit was funded, and then in '88 was when AZT was being tested in large numbers. And so let me just, from that side, the AIDS clinical trial unit in Columbus has always been what is respected, but but actually a real accruer. We have a lot of people who come and volunteer for studies. We have actually more people in Columbus who volunteer for studies than in most other large cities. I mean, if you compare our activities and what we do in Columbus in terms of volunteers for clinical trials, the numbers per capita are many times higher than it is in New York or Miami or other places. So the community does volunteer and gets involved with clinical trials and new drugs, which is honestly, and not only that, relative to all the other places in the country which do these clinical trials, when we put a person in a clinical trial, the chance that they're going to finish it, that is participate until the end, is greater in Columbus than any other city. That the people actually follow through. It's the Midwest. They follow through. They agree to do something and they do it. Whereas our what's called retention rates are about 90%. They may be 60% or less in some places. And so it's a good community.
And Mike, it's interesting all that you were just saying. Why would that be in Columbus? And actually, Jose and I were just chatting earlier today about how this town, and I think many do, but this town runs on relationship. And I just think in hearing what we're hearing tonight, the relationships that were critical back in 1981 and 82 to allowing, these people to come together at St. Stephen's Church to be able to support their loved ones and some that they didn't even know. And the relationships, with Mike and the other physicians and, how that kind of carried forward, I think, in a trusting way, perhaps, but still in your face when something needed to be treated that way. I know that actually I kind of chuckle that very helpful to me were the relationships, and to us in public health were the relationships with the gay community, and yet there was already a breakfast club, so we had to have lunch group. But it was really important because it was a way that we could hear what's really going on out there, and some of it we didn't want to hear, but we really needed to hear it, and so that was really helpful. And then on the other hand there's the message. You guys have to do something about this, and we can't do it, but you can. And so having those kinds of relationships, I think have, whether it's around the clinical trials and allowing people to have both access to cutting edge treatment and learning from that, but also being hopefully assisted by that, but also preventing future cases. Seeing that the money, goes to places where they really can provide value. I'll tell you, the relationships, I know our mayor doesn't like to call it a cow town. It's not a cow town. But these relationships have been so strong and have allowed others to come and be a part of them. It really has been kind of an amazing place for that. And hearing you talk just about the clinical trials just is another example of that, whether it's the early money and how that allowed things, the early gatherings, the agencies that have been able to support, mentioning Shanti and all of the different San Francisco organizations, a lot of them have floundered and gone away. And we still have one key as was called about, but we have some other organizations and they do serve different parts of our community and they've been supported as well. But it really is, it's interesting, these relationships.
If we had a crisis now, we could pull it off.
Yes, but my fear, look at us. We got gray hair, some of us may not have so much left. We got people who have been doing this work all these years who quite frankly are aging out and nobody new is stepping up to the plate, and
that's a problem.
I think that's a really good segue to how I thought we might close this evening, and I thought I would give each of the panel members an opportunity to give a parting thought. It could be whatever you want. It could be an anecdote. It could be something you want people to take away about the crisis or how they need to behave in the future with regard to sexual practices. Whatever you want to share. Start with Howard.
Well, I'm just honored to be here. it's been a long, long journey, and I'm just grateful to so many people in this community who provided an immense amount of support. All the guys with AIDS I've worked with over the years, many of whom aren't here, some of whom thankfully are still here, taught me so much. Teresa and I were talking earlier about, having joy in your life. And if anything, those guys taught me, it was that we have to treasure each moment, whether we have AIDS or whether we don't. And we have to learn how to trust each other. And I don't think it's an accident that, people trusted Mike Parra and trust the AIDS Clinical Trial Unit or trust the Columbus Health Department. Because folks like you all, put it out there that you can trust us, and you proved. And I think the community proved, that we could trust the Columbus AIDS Taskforce, and they went through all sorts of things, and but the community keeps coming forward, and I just want to encourage everybody here to just keep acting up and keep supporting the people who need support. I'm very scared about where we are in the crisis in terms of the new cases that are coming up. Despite all the work we've done, there's still lots of people who have HIV who never tell anybody, who sometimes don't tell sexual partners, which really scares me. And I just, we have to keep working on still creating an environment which says it's okay to be open about who you are, and it's important to tell people. So that's what I'd say. Thank you.
Well, I was trying to think of a parting, because I had a heads up you were going to ask this question. But I don't have a good answer, because I think what Howard said is true. It ultimately, and Smokey, I agree. This is about leaving a legacy as well, and really it's who's going to take this up. And so a couple things I would say. One is that it really is about you, and you being people who are young, people who are old, etc. And it's about people feeling good about themselves. It's about people respecting themselves, about realizing that we are worthy, that we're worthy to take care of ourselves, to speak up, to act up, to take care of ourselves, that we don't keep the silence, but we actually break silence, whether it's about sexual activity, about potential exposures, about how we can be a stronger community if we work together. I'm doing a lot of work right now around the issues around the changing face of this epidemic and many other chronic disease epidemics, and how interesting that we can call HIV and AIDS a chronic disease epidemic. There's a whole other way of thinking. But part of what's different about this nation and other nations that I'm learning about is that we have a culture that's called a yo-yo culture. You're on your own. And so what's very interesting is that the nations that have a very different philosophy about how they live, the WITT, the WIT nations, they really are in it together. We're in this together. And I think one of the really ahas that I hadn't really thought about until I was sitting here tonight is that rather than be the yo-yos that we usually are, you're on your own as a nation, and we believe that around HIV and AIDS, there was this, we're in this together. And so if I was going to leave any kind of thought, it's how do we transform our community and our nation to be a WIT nation? How can we really convey and act that we're in this together?
So I guess I regard myself as fortunate that I get a chance to see this fatal disease be attacked by medical science and literally almost overcome, at least turn from something that you were going to die from to something that literally is easier to treat than high blood pressure. Now, there's certainly tremendous stigma that still goes with it, but at least I regard myself as lucky to have seen this kind of, and been able to help people from one stage to the other. I also regard myself as lucky to have seeing this coming together, I saw so many young people die, and so many families and so many friends come to the aid of people who were dying of this illness that you learn the importance of friends, you learn the importance of family, you learn the importance of every day of your life, because there's no guarantee that it's going to be there. And so I guess I just I don't know if there's much any special thing to say other than that I think it has been a real learning experience, and I do appreciate what I've learned from the gay community in terms of friendship, because you don't often see that.
Like Howard, I am also grateful to be here tonight and for the experience really over the last 15 plus years. It does worry me a little bit that though I think we could call each other and respond to a crisis tonight, our community is not responding to some of the crises that we're currently having. And that does worry me. I think we have, in a sense, a short memory. And there's no new sense, to quote Dr. Long, of outrage. Debbie just shared with me today that we're still seeing 100 people a year diagnosed in our own clinic at the health department. So, and yet there's no activism or rage about that. We have a crystal meth problem, and it's devastating. You cannot imagine how much. 4 or 5 great friends that have lost everything, and there's no outrage about it. They just kind of disappear and go away. And that worries me. We're all worried about marriage, and we're worried about the next nicer car and the next nicer condo and all the material things. So how do we go back to that activism and that grassroots? I don't know. I don't have the answer, and perhaps I'm too old to figure it out. I just got to move on. But as far as safer sex, I think that the best tip or advice that I can give you is self-esteem and loving oneself. I think that's key. It was key at the beginning of the epidemic. It's key for straight people. It's key for gay people. Is when we have the ability to do that, I think then we're able to make healthier choices. If we don't have the ability to do that, then we continue to make perhaps not the right choices.
Well, I think you've heard our public health concern about how things are at the moment and where we'd like to see more engagement and involvement and change. I'd like to point out every now and then to folks that this may not be the last significant infectious disease we face. I mean, there could be something else that is even, as severe or more so. I mean, for a long time we did see Legionella and different things emerge pretty quickly, and I think we sort of assume this is it, and this is as bad as it ever might be. I hope it is, and I hope that any lessons we've learned we can quickly apply, but I always keep that in the back of my mind when I see, some of the challenges that we deal with. And to end on a little lighter note, I think you probably recognize we're all way too young to be historians. To be here tonight, but yet working with this issue, I mean, the friendships that I have made, the professional growth, the personal growth, the opportunity to really be proud of being in Columbus and hearing around the world when we would go, or the world, but the nation, when we would present our plans or talk about things that we were doing with funding, they're like, where are you from? You're from Columbus? And everybody always assumed it was the cities that got all the money. And I continue to be just really proud that I was able to be a part of all of this and to grow. Inspired by people like Mike Para and Howard Fradkin, who never have learned in all these years how to say no. I mean, continue to say, I'll be there, I'll do that, what do you need? Yes. And that's really amazing to have colleagues and role models that are that committed.
Well, while I realize saying thank you is hardly adequate for sharing your time tonight or all the contributions you've made to the community in the past, that's where we'll have to start. I just want to say to each and every one of you, thank you very much